All right, let's dive deep into the Underground Railroad, but this time, way back to its beginnings.
The very, very start.
Yeah, I bet a lot of people listening already know a good bit about it, but today we're looking at this podcast episode
Hmm.
that really gets into how it all started and some of the big names, the people who really got it going.
Oh, yeah. The pioneers.
Yeah. Think back to America in the late 1700s, early 1800s.
Oh, wow.
Slavery's everywhere, but so is this powerful yearning for freedom.
Absolutely.
We're going to hear stories about people like Sandy. He was an enslaved shoemaker owned by Thomas Jefferson, of all people.
Wow.
And we'll learn about this Quaker, just like pulling off these daring rescues.
That's incredible.
Oh, and get this, a whole family making this crazy escape to Canada.
That's a journey.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Be prepared for some wild twists and turns.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're talking about people risking everything, showing crazy bravery when the danger was just off the charts.
It's hard to even imagine what they went through. We often think of the Underground Railroad as this super organized system.
Right, like a well-oiled machine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But in those early days, it was much more about individual acts of bravery, like split-second decisions that could mean life or death.
It really gets you thinking, like, what would I have done if I were in their shoes?
Really does.
Knowing what was at stake. I
Yeah.
mean, how do you even wrap your head around, like, all men are created equal when you're owning slaves?
Yeah.
Especially for someone like Thomas Jefferson. He wrote those very words.
That's the irony, right? A real head-scratcher for historians, even today. Some folks say, well, he was a product of his time. His views on slavery were, complicated. Maybe they changed as he got older.
Okay, interesting.
Others point out, look, he inherited a ton of slaves and was drowning in debt. Like, freeing them wasn't simple financially.
Makes sense, but it's still...
Yeah, no matter what he actually believed, him owning slaves just shows how deeply messed up American society was.
It was, and then you've got the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793.
Oh, man.
Basically turning the entire country into a giant hunting ground for runaway slaves. It made it the law for people to help catch them, even up north, where slavery was illegal.
Wow. So even in the so-called free states.
Can you imagine the fear? Being a free black person up north, always looking over your shoulder, afraid of being snatched and dragged back into slavery.
That's terrifying.
It's awful.
Mhm.
That act basically turned compassion into a crime, helping someone escape to freedom. Illegal. But some people were just like, nope, not going to stand for this.
They had to do something.
People like Isaac Hopper, he was this Quaker abolitionist in Philadelphia, already pulling off these crazy rescues way before the Underground Railroad even had its name.
A true trailblazer.
Oh, yeah. The podcast tells this story about Hopper. He's working with a police officer. They'd literally sail out to this ship on the Delaware River to rescue this little girl who'd been kidnapped.
Oh, my gosh.
They even got threatened with a gun.
You're kidding.
I know, right?
Hmm.
Talk about bravery.
It's incredible. Hopper's story really shows those early kind of scattered efforts that would all come together to form the Underground Railroad.
Like the building blocks.
Exactly. And he's a great example of how important Quakers were in the fight against slavery. They believed everyone was equal, so they were some of the loudest voices against it.
Yeah. They put their beliefs into action.
For sure. And it wasn't just up north either. The podcast also talks about Levi Coffin, a Quaker from North Carolina, and his cousin Vestal.
Down south.
Yep. They started hiding runaway slaves on their farm, risking everything. It shows that this resistance was happening all over, not just in one place.
So it wasn't just a northern thing.
Not at all. The Coffins represent this fascinating shift from those solo acts of defiance towards something more organized. It wasn't super formal yet, but they were planting the seeds.
Laying the foundation.
Exactly. And there's this crazy story about how Levi protected this runaway named Jack Barnes, slave catchers after, right?
Oh, no.
And Levi, he thinks fast, even gets a local judge involved to keep Barnes safe.
Clever.
You had to be so creative back then. I mean, Levi was literally breaking the law, but he knew the Fugitive Slave Act was wrong, and he followed his conscience.
Powerful stuff.
It really makes you think, what would you do if you were in his position? Would you risk your own freedom to do the right thing?
It's easy to admire these people, breaking the law to help others. But we can't forget how dangerous escaping actually was.
Right.
Reaching the North didn't mean you were safe. The Fugitive Slave Act, its reach was everywhere. Freedom was never a sure thing, always had to fight for it. And the podcast really drives that home with the story of Sam, another runaway the Coffins tried to help. He was traveling with a Quaker family to Indiana, but got separated and ended up asking this poor white guy for help.
Oh, no.
Yes.
That doesn't sound good. And that's where things went south. This guy, he didn't see someone needing help. He saw a chance to make some money.
Oh, no, really?
Yeah. Turned Sam in. He knew there was a reward for catching runaway slaves.
Wow, that's just heartbreaking.
It really shows that even when you have these incredible acts of courage and kindness, there was also greed and prejudice, you know? It makes you think about the choices we make, the things we do, and the things we don't do. Would you have taken that risk to help someone, knowing you could lose everything?
Really makes you examine your own values, doesn't it? And like history, it's not always a simple story of good guys and bad guys. It's messy.
Absolutely. And think about it, for every story we hear about the Underground Railroad, there are so many that we'll never know about. All those secret operations, so much of it is lost to time.
Yeah, God forever. Which is why these personal stories are so precious. They give us a peek into this hidden world, all of the resistance and strength.
They really do.
And speaking of strength, the podcast tells this incredible story about Josiah Henson, an enslaved preacher who escapes to Canada with his family. That's like, wow, the human spirit can endure anything.
It really can. Henson's story is so powerful because it shows the emotional toll of slavery. I mean, he went through such horrific trauma. He saw his father brutally punished.
Oh my gosh.
And then later, he was tricked into leading other enslaved people deeper into slave territory.
You're kidding?
Think about the guilt he must have felt.
Awful. It's hard to imagine carrying that weight. But he still found a way to escape, not just for himself, but for his whole family.
And a 600-mile journey.
600 miles, relying on his own smarts, his faith, the kindness of strangers.
Imagine the constant fear. Always looking over their shoulder, wondering if this is it, if they're going to be caught, separated.
The podcast uses Henson's own words. He talks about the terror of always expecting to hear dogs and slave catchers coming after them.
I bet that fear was just constant.
I can't even imagine. There's this part where Henson has to beg for food from a white woman. He has no idea if she'll help or turn him in.
Oh my goodness, what a risk.
Later, he meets a group of Native Americans who share their food with him and his family. It's like these chance meetings, they show how unpredictable their journey was.
Yeah, and every encounter was a risk. Those small acts of kindness, they must have felt like a miracle. Shows the power of empathy, you know, even when everything around you is designed to dehumanize people.
Yeah, it wasn't just chance encounters. There were people actively working to dismantle slavery who helped him. In the podcast, there's this scene where another enslaved person rows Henson and his family across the Ohio River into Indiana, knowing he could get in huge trouble.
Oh, wow.
Talk about solidarity, risking everything to help others reach freedom.
That's incredible. It reminds us that the fight for freedom, it wasn't just individuals, it was a whole network, working together, bound by shared experiences and this common goal.
That's powerful. And in the end, Henson and his family make it to Canada, finally free. A real reminder that even in the darkest times, hope can win.
Henson's story is truly inspiring, but it also makes you think about the bigger picture. All these brave acts, they were mostly individual efforts, improvising as they went. How did this movement grow from those individual acts into something more organized? What needed to happen for it to really expand and reach more people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like, how do you turn bravery into a whole movement? What does it take to turn those little sparks of resistance into something that can really make a change?
It's definitely more than just individual heroes. It needed a bigger shift. Like society, politics, people had to really see how horrible slavery was and be willing to do something about it.
So it wasn't just about what people believed personally.
No way. The Underground Railroad didn't just magically appear. It took a whole bunch of things, like moral outrage, religious beliefs, and then those organized abolitionist movements, they all played a part. Plus, you can't forget the people who risked their lives for freedom.
I always thought of it as this really structured organization, but it sounds more like those early days where people just doing what they could.
You're actually not far off. The term Underground Railroad didn't really become a thing until the 1830s.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and even then, it wasn't like one big group with a leader and everything. It was more like a bunch of local groups kind of doing their own thing, but all working towards the same goal.
It's more like a patchwork of resistance, not a well-oiled machine.
Exactly. All these people and groups spread out across the country, but all following the same moral compass. Some were driven by their faith, like the Quakers. Others just wanted justice or couldn't stand to see people suffer under slavery.
And we already know how dangerous it was. But imagine the trust and secrecy they needed. Just one slip-up could mean getting caught, going to jail, or even death. Not just for you, but for everyone you were trying to help.
That's a heavy burden to carry. But even with all that risk, the Underground Railroad kept growing. It became this beacon of hope for people trapped in slavery.
Hearing all these stories, it makes me think we usually focus on the journey to freedom, the physical part.
Right.
But there was also this inner journey, all the courage and resilience.
That's such an important point. These stories aren't just about escaping chains. They're about how compassionate and brave people can be, and how they never give up on freedom no matter what. It shows us what the human spirit is really capable of.
As we wrap up our deep dive into the early days of the Underground Railroad, I'm just blown away by everyone who fought for freedom. So inspiring.
Absolutely. And remember, these stories aren't just from the past. They have lessons for us today. They remind us to stand up for what's right, even when it's scary, and that working together can make a real difference against injustice.
I hope listening to this has made you appreciate all those who came before us, and maybe it's even sparked some questions in your own mind. How can we use what we learned from the Underground Railroad to face today's challenges? How can we keep fighting for equality and justice in our own time? Something to think about as we all continue our own journeys.